One night, Elena, a quiet cleaning lady, accidentally disturbs important papers in a powerful CEO's office. This simple mistake could cost her everything, or it might just change her life forever. What happens when a small error leads to a surprising new role? It was a rainy night in Manhattan, the kind that blurred the glow of streetlights and turned sidewalks into shimmering mirrors. Elena Rivera quietly stepped off the bus, pulling her worn coat tighter around herself, feeling the bitter cold seep into her bones. At 25, life had already tested her resilience more times than she cared to count, but nothing prepared her for what awaited that evening. She quickly crossed the bustling street toward the towering building that pierced the misty sky, Thorne Technologies. Elena had only recently started working as a nighttime cleaner there, a position she took out of sheer necessity to pay for her mother's medical bills. Invisible by design, her rule was clear: never, ever draw attention to herself. The lobby was silent, its luxurious marble floors polished until they shone like glass. Elena exchanged brief, courteous nods with the security guard, who barely glanced up from his newspaper. Like most nights, she pushed her cleaning cart through silent hallways, filled only with echoes of her quiet footsteps. But tonight was different. Her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion after covering a colleague's shift at her other job. Her tired eyes fought to stay open, and her mind wandered to worries about her mother's declining health. Distracted, Elena stepped into an office unlike any other. A sprawling, lavish space reserved solely for Alexander Thorne, the CEO known for his ruthless perfectionism and intimidating presence. She carefully approached the massive desk, meticulously organized as though arranged with mathematical precision. Elena started dusting lightly, but suddenly, a wave of dizziness overcame her. In a fleeting moment of weakness, her hand knocked against a towering stack of papers. Documents scattered to the floor like autumn leaves caught in a merciless wind. Her heart froze. She frantically gathered the papers, praying she'd returned them to the right order, her pulse pounding as if she'd just committed an unforgivable crime. As Elena hurriedly finished, anxiety gnawed at her chest, heavy and relentless. The shadowy office, usually calm and serene, now felt oppressive and threatening. She couldn't help but wonder, had she just thrown away her mother's last chance for medical care? Would this simple mistake cost her everything she had worked so desperately for? Elena spent the rest of the night haunted by worry, cleaning mindlessly, fearing that sunrise would only bring trouble. She never imagined that this very incident would become the turning point of her life. But how could she have known that a mistake made in exhaustion and fear would soon thrust her into a world she never even dreamed existed? As dawn slowly broke over the sleeping city, Elena quietly left the building, unaware that the office camera had captured everything: her mistake, her panic, and the moment Alexander Thorne's cold gaze narrowed curiously at the screen, planning something no one would ever see coming. The following morning, the sky over Manhattan cleared, but Elena's thoughts remained clouded. She barely slept, her mind looping over every second spent in that office, every paper touched, every breath taken in a space where she knew she didn't belong. As she stirred a spoon through a chipped mug of instant coffee, her mother's soft voice broke through the silence. "Elena, are you okay?" her mother asked gently, sensing the tension in her daughter's eyes. Elena forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mama. Just tired." But she wasn't fine. Her stomach twisted with dread. She knew how powerful men like Alexander Thorne handled mistakes, swift, cold, unforgiving. And she was just a cleaning lady. One among many. Easily replaceable. So, when her phone rang hours later with a number she didn't recognize, her heart nearly stopped. "Miss Rivera, Mr. Thorne would like to see you in his office immediately." The woman's voice was calm, clipped. Elena's hands trembled as she hung up the phone. Why would the CEO himself call her in? Most executives in that building didn't even acknowledge her presence. She was trained to be invisible, and she had succeeded until now. The elevator ride to the top floor felt eternal. Every floor that blinked past sent her heartbeat racing faster. As the doors opened, she stepped into silence, greeted only by the polished sound of her own shoes on marble. A sleek assistant pointed wordlessly toward the massive double doors. Inside, Alexander Thorne stood by the window, his back to her. He didn't speak right away. The silence stretched, thick with something she couldn't name. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. Her voice caught in her throat, unsure if she should apologize or just brace for the blow. When he finally turned around, his expression wasn't what she expected. No anger, no shouting, just curiosity. "You rearranged the order of a highly confidential contract," he said flatly. "Do you realize what could have happened?" She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "But," he interrupted, stepping closer, "you fixed it, without knowing what it was, and you didn't run." Her breath hitched. What kind of game was this? What Elena didn't know, what no one knew, was that Alexander had been watching the footage on repeat, studying her expression, her panic, her honesty. Something about the way she moved, the quiet dignity in her fear, had struck a nerve he thought he no longer had. "Sit down, Miss Rivera," he said calmly, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "There's something I'd like to offer you." And just like that, the floor beneath her seemed to shift. This wasn't a dismissal. But what was it? Elena sat down slowly, as if the chair might vanish beneath her. Her hands were folded tightly on her lap, knuckles pale. Across from her, Alexander Thorne leaned back in his chair, watching her not like a CEO observing an employee, but like a man trying to solve a riddle that refused to be solved. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt heavier, tense, measured. "You've worked here for how long?" he asked, finally breaking the quiet. 2 months, she replied, barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze not leaving hers. "And in those 2 months, no one's noticed you." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Elena didn't know what to say, so she simply stayed still. What could she possibly add? She had intended to go unnoticed. That was the point. That was safe. Alexander stood, walked slowly to the window again. Manhattan pulsed outside. Taxis, people, movement, power. But in that office, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. "I have a situation," he said without turning around. "A personal one. It requires discretion, humility, and someone who isn't going to chase after my name like a prize." Elena blinked, unsure if she was hearing him correctly. "I need a wife," he said bluntly, turning back to her. "For 3 weeks, no romance, no strings. Just a name on a paper, a few appearances, and then nothing, it'll be over." Her breath caught in her chest. "I'm sorry." "What?" she asked, stunned. "I'm offering you a promotion," he continued, stepping closer. "You'll serve as my temporary personal assistant. That's what the paperwork will say. But behind closed doors, I'll need your cooperation for something far more delicate." He didn't smile. He didn't joke. This wasn't some twisted prank. Alexander Thorne was serious. "You'll be paid handsomely," he added, sensing her hesitation. "Enough to take care of your mother, medical bills, living expenses, everything." It was too much, too fast. Elena's mind swirled with disbelief, confusion, and something else she didn't dare name. Why her? Why not a woman from his world? Someone polished and powerful. She should have walked out right then, told him no. But something about the way he spoke, the careful control, the guarded edge in his voice, it told her that this wasn't just business. This was personal, and he was desperate. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Why me?" Alexander didn't flinch. "Because you're the only person I've met in years who has nothing to gain by being near me." And just like that, the line between their worlds began to blur. Elena stepped out of the CEO's office, feeling as though the floor beneath her feet was made of glass, thin, fragile, one wrong step away from shattering completely. The city outside still hummed with its usual chaos, but for her, everything had gone quiet. She didn't answer Alexander right away. He gave her time. A full 24 hours. But that only made the weight of the decision heavier. She walked the city like a ghost, replaying his words over and over again in her mind. A wife for 3 weeks. Enough money to save your mother. No strings. It sounded simple, but nothing about it felt simple. At home, her mother's breathing was more labored than usual. The medication wasn't enough anymore. The doctors had been clear. Without a better treatment plan, things would only get worse. Elena watched her sleep. Her frail hands curled against her chest and something inside her cracked. She didn't want to accept the offer. But how could she say no? The next morning, dressed in borrowed clothes and with her heart pounding like a drum, Elena walked back into Thorne Technologies. Not as a janitor, but as Alexander Thorne's assistant. At least, that's what everyone was told. The transformation was instant. The same people who never looked her in the eye were suddenly full of smiles, shallow compliments, curious stares. The elevator she once shared with mop buckets now carried her straight to the top floor, where a desk waited for her, sleek, empty, intimidating. Alexander was already there, seated behind his fortress of a desk. He looked up only briefly. "You came," he said, as if he'd never doubted it. Elena nodded. "You were right about one thing," she said softly. "I don't have anything to gain, but I have too much to lose." He didn't reply, but a flicker passed through his eyes. Relief or something else? The days that followed moved like a strange dream. Elena learned to navigate meetings, memorize names, keep schedules perfectly timed. But the hardest part wasn't the work. It was pretending. Pretending she belonged in rooms filled with power suits and sharp smiles. Pretending she didn't hear the whispers that followed her down the hall. Pretending she was something she wasn't. And through it all, Alexander watched. Distant, composed, unreadable. But even distance has cracks, because in stolen moments, between meetings, in shared elevators, in the silence of late-night calls, there were glances, pauses, words left unsaid. And Elena couldn't help but wonder, was this still just a deal? Or had something already started slipping through the cracks? It started with something small, a forgotten jacket. It was late, past midnight. The office lights had dimmed to a soft glow, casting long shadows across the glass walls. Elena was at her desk, going over details for a charity event Alexander was expected to attend the next morning. She had learned his preferences, his routines, even the way he liked his coffee. Black, no sugar, always after 7:15 a.m. sharp. She thought she was starting to understand him, until she saw it. Draped over the back of his chair, a jacket he never left behind. Neatly folded worn leather, with a faint scent of something she couldn't name. It wasn't part of the image he showed the world. It was something personal. And for a reason she couldn't explain, she picked it up. Inside the pocket, her fingers brushed against paper. Folded, thin. Hesitant but curious, she opened it. A child's drawing, crayons, faded. A stick figure holding hands with a taller figure beside a son with a smiling face. On the bottom, in shaky handwriting, "To Daddy." Elena's chest tightened. She hadn't known Alexander had a child. He never mentioned family, never spoke of anything beyond numbers, deadlines, and appearances. But here it was, proof of a life that once existed, or still did. She quickly placed the drawing back where she found it, but the damage was done. Her idea of him, the untouchable, unshakable Alexander Thorne, was already unraveling. He had a past, a tender one, hidden so carefully that even his closest employees didn't know. But she'd seen it now, and it wouldn't leave her mind. The next morning, Elena said nothing. Neither did he. But something in his eyes had shifted when he looked at her. Not suspicion, not anger, just something softer. Something like fear. Not the kind that comes from danger, the kind that comes from being seen, and that terrified him more than anything. Days passed, but something unspoken lingered between them. Elena continued her role, quiet and efficient, never bringing up the drawing. She had learned to wear silence like armor, the way Alexander did. But beneath the polished routines and professional distance, The air around them had changed. It was heavier, charged, like a storm waiting to break. One evening, as they left a board meeting, Alexander surprised her. "Walk with me," he said, not as a command but as a request. They stepped out into the cool night air, the city alive with sounds that somehow felt far away. Elena followed him through a quiet street lined with brownstones and trees barely touched by spring. It was strange, seeing him outside the glass tower, in a world not built on power, but on memory. "My father used to live on this street," he said after a long silence. "Before the company, before everything." She glanced at him, surprised. He never spoke about his past. It felt like holding your breath too long and suddenly taking in air. "He was a quiet man," Alexander continued, eyes on the pavement. "Worked hard, didn't have much. But every Sunday he took me to the park at the end of the block, made me believe the world could be kind." Elena said nothing, afraid that even a breath might break the moment. "But kindness doesn't last," he added, voice lower now. "He died when I was 16. I buried that version of the world with him." She felt a deep ache in her chest. Not pity, recognition. That quiet kind of grief that lives in silence, where no one sees it, but you carry it everywhere. When they reached the end of the street, he stopped and looked at her, not with the cold gaze of a CEO, but as a man who didn't want to be alone in that memory anymore. "You saw the drawing, didn't you?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. Elena nodded slowly, and he didn't get angry. He just closed his eyes for a moment, like he'd been waiting for someone, not to ask, not to judge, but simply to know. What else, she wondered, was buried beneath the suit, behind those guarded eyes? And more importantly, was she ready to find out? The first time Elena wore the ring, her hands shook. It wasn't real. She reminded herself of that every time she looked at it. The diamond was large, cold, almost mocking, a symbol of a promise that didn't come from the heart, but from necessity. And yet, as Alexander slid it onto her finger in front of his legal team, there was something in the way he looked at her that made her question everything. "You'll need to start answering as my fiancé now," he said quietly, with a slight smirk, "even if just for show." Elena nodded, but her heart wasn't calm. This wasn't just some game anymore. It was a role she had to play in front of investors, partners, the press, and people who would love to see Alexander Thorne fail. One wrong word, one wrong gesture, and everything could collapse. She wasn't just part of his plan now, she was the plan. The first public event came faster than she expected. A private dinner with the investors from Dubai. Serious, sharp-eyed men who had no interest in American formalities. Alexander introduced her as his future wife, his voice steady, his hand firm around hers. Elena smiled politely, repeated the rehearsed lines, answered their questions with calm. But beneath the table, her fingers trembled. She felt like a girl pretending to be a woman who belonged there. But the room was full of polished laughter and coded glances. No one suspected the truth. Not yet. And that somehow frightened her more than if they had. Later that night, in the black car driving them home, she leaned against the window in silence. "You did well," Alexander said, glancing at her. She didn't answer right away. The city blurred past outside. "They believed it," she whispered. "That's what we needed." But that wasn't what she needed. Because with every successful lie, the line between truth and pretense grew thinner. With every smile she gave in front of strangers, a part of her wondered if he was pretending too. Or had he already begun to believe the lie himself? And if he had, what would happen when the truth could no longer be hidden? As the charade deepened, the stakes grew higher. Elena found herself swept up in a world she'd only ever glimpsed through polished glass and shining screens. Each day brought a new challenge, a new facade to uphold. And with each smile, each hand she shook as Mrs. Thorne to be, a part of her feared she was losing herself to this illusion. One crisp evening, as they prepared for yet another gala, Alexander seemed more distant than usual. His silences, once just a part of his nature, now felt loaded with unspoken thoughts. Elena watched him from across the room as he adjusted his tie with meticulous care. He caught her gaze in the mirror and paused, his eyes holding hers for a lingering moment. "Are you all right?" she asked, stepping closer. The question felt trivial, but it hung in the air between them, dense and significant. "I'm fine," he replied, turning away slightly. But his voice betrayed a hint of something else, something like strain or perhaps fatigue. Elena wasn't sure anymore. At the gala, the lights were dazzling, the music a perfect blend of classical and contemporary, and the guests a mosaic of the city's elite. Elena moved through the crowd, playing her part with a grace she hadn't known she possessed. But her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the look Alexander had given her, the weariness she'd heard in his voice. Midway through the evening, a well-dressed woman approached her, a sleek smile playing on her lips. "Elena, isn't it? Alexander hasn't stopped talking about you. How lucky you are to be stepping into this world," she said, her voice dripping with a mix of envy and disdain. Elena nodded politely, her smile fixed. "I am very fortunate," she replied, her voice steady despite the churn of her stomach. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to decipher if Elena truly believed her own words. Then, without warning, she leaned in closer. "Just be careful, dear. People in our circle love a spectacle, and there's nothing they enjoy more than a fall from grace." Elena's heart skipped a beat. The warning, whether meant kindly or not, sent a shiver down her spine. She excused herself and found a quiet balcony, the cool air a sharp contrast to the warmth inside. Alexander found her there minutes later, his expression somber. "You disappeared," he said, his tone more of concern than accusation. "I needed a moment," Elena admitted, turning to face the city skyline. The lights below seemed to hold the entire world's secrets. He joined her by the railing, his presence a silent question. They stood there together, the noise of the gala muffled by the glass doors. "This isn't just about the contract anymore, is it?" she asked quietly, not looking at him. Alexander hesitated, then his gaze found the horizon, dark and endless. "No," he said finally, his voice almost lost to the wind. "It's not." And in that confession, the storm they'd been dancing around began to close in, inevitable and uncontrollable. As the days dwindled toward the end of their agreement, Elena found herself caught between relief and a gnawing sense of dread. What would happen when this all ended? She was no longer sure she wanted to know. But life, as always, had a way of answering questions you hadn't dared to ask aloud. It was during a particularly rainy morning that the truth came crashing down. They were in the office early, the city still a blur of wet streets and hurried umbrellas outside the window. Alexander was unusually quiet, his eyes often drifting to the cityscape, lost in thought. "Alexander," Elena began, breaking the silence. "After this is over, let's not talk about the end yet," he interrupted softly, not meeting her gaze. But Elena persisted, driven by a need to understand. "We have to. I need to know where I stand when the curtain falls." He finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And what if I said I don't want it to end?" The question hung in the air, heavy and fraught with implications. Elena's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" Before he could answer, the phone rang. It was a shrill, jarring sound that seemed to slice through the moment. With a sigh, Alexander turned to answer it, and Elena was left to ponder his words, her mind racing. The conversation on the phone was brief, but when Alexander hung up, his face was pale, his usual composure slipping. "That was my lawyer," he said slowly. "The investors are ready to finalize everything. They're pleased with how convincingly we've played our parts." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "And the contract? It ends in 3 days, he replied, his voice hollow. 3 days. The reality of it struck Elena with unexpected force. 3 more days of pretending, of playing the perfect couple, then back to her old life as if none of this had ever happened. She tried to speak, to express some of the turmoil she felt, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she watched as Alexander approached, his steps uncertain. "Elena, these weeks with you," he started, then paused, searching for the right words. "They've changed something in me. I don't expect you to—" But before he could finish, the door burst open. A colleague, breathless, panicked. "Alexander, you need to see this now. It's urgent." Whatever personal moment they might have shared was lost, swept away as quickly as it had surfaced. Alexander gave her a resigned look, a silent apology, and followed his colleague out. Elena was left standing alone, the echo of his confession reverberating in the empty office. As the reality of their situation settled around her like so much dust, she understood finally that whatever they were building wasn't just for show. The facade was crumbling, revealing something far more real beneath the surface. And now, with only days left on the clock, the true test of their relationship wasn't going to be how well they could pretend, but how bravely they could face the truths they had uncovered. On the final day of their contract, the city dawned clear and bright, as if the weather itself was mocking the turmoil that churned in Elena's heart. She arrived at the office early, the building eerily quiet, the calm before the storm of their last public appearance as a couple. Alexander was already there, standing by the window, staring out at the skyline with a contemplative look. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a hint of the storm raging inside him. "Morning," Elena replied, her own voice a mix of nervousness and resolve. She had made a decision last night, one that had kept her awake until the early hours, turning over every word, every glance they had shared. Today would mark the end of their agreement, but perhaps also the beginning of something new, something real. She approached him slowly, her steps measured, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice stronger than she felt, "about what you said the other day, about not wanting things to end." Alexander's gaze fixed on her, intense and searching. "And?" he prompted, his voice low. Elena took a deep breath, her decision clear in her mind, her resolve firm. "I don't want it to end either. Not like this. Not now." The words hung between them, bold and unyielding. Alexander stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Elena, are you sure? This world I live in, it's complicated. It's harsh. I can't promise you." "I don't need promises of perfection, Alexander," she interrupted, her voice tinged with passion. "I just need the truth. The real you, not the CEO, not the facade you show the world." For a moment he just looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Then slowly a smile began to spread across his face. A genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his entire demeanor. "That's all I have to offer," he said. "The truth. And perhaps a chance to make things right." They stood there, in the heart of the financial district, worlds apart from where they'd started, yet somehow closer than they'd ever been. Elena reached out, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining naturally. The door opened then, their cue to make one last appearance to seal their contract in the eyes of the world. But as they walked towards the door, their hands still joined, Elena felt a surge of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever storms they would have to weather, they would face them together. Not as a CEO and his temporary wife, but as two people who had found something real amidst a sea of pretense. As they stepped out into the world, hand in hand, the future uncertain but promising, Elena knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. As Elena and Alexander stepped forward into their new reality, it wasn't just a conclusion of a contractual facade, but the dawn of a genuine relationship, built on the foundations of unexpected truth and shared vulnerability. Their journey reminds us of the power of authenticity in a world that often values appearance over reality. How often do we hide behind the masks we create? How frequently do we choose comfort over the courage it takes to show our true selves? Elena and Alexander's story challenges us to question our own facades and consider what might happen if we chose to live authentically, even when it's difficult. It makes one wonder, what masks are you wearing? Could you take a step toward your own truth today? Perhaps it's time to reconsider the roles we play and embrace a life of genuine connections, If you're inspired by Elena and Alexander's journey to find truth and authenticity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss out on more stories like this. Your engagement helps us bring more such heartfelt stories to light. And if you're curious to see more transformative stories that might challenge you to change your life, click on the video appearing on the screen right now. Dive into another tale of courage and change. Thank you for watching, and remember, the path to truth might be unexpected, but it's always worth walking.